2 point-blank shots in broad daylight left a president's lover dead, yet the killer took absolutely nothing. The police quickly dismissed this clinical execution as a botched street robbery, but a perfect kill zone, a framed bystander, and a confiscated diary point directly to a CIA assassination. Today, we tear away decades of government lies to expose how the deep state permanently silences its security risks. This is the declassified murder file of Mary Pinchot Meyer. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. was not just a residential enclave, it was the nerve center of the free world. It was a closed, hermetically sealed fraternity of Ivy League educated men who were quietly transitioning from the battlefields of the Second World War into the clandestine battlegrounds of the Cold War. In 1945, Mary Pinchot, a woman of formidable intellect, fierce independence, and vaster education, married Cord Meyer. Cord was a decorated war hero, an idealist who initially championed the concept of a world government. But the system has a uniquely terrifying way of devouring idealists and repurposing them as its most ruthless enforcers. As the shadow of the Soviet Union lengthened, Cord Meyer was recruited by Allen Dulles into the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. Mary found herself thrust into the epicenter of the Georgetown set. Her dining room table became the proving ground for American foreign policy. She served martinis to men like Frank Wisner, Richard Helms, and James Jesus Angleton, the architects of covert overthrows, psychological warfare, and global espionage. It is crucial to understand the psychological environment in which Mary was forced to exist. The CIA in the 1950s was a monolithic, patriarchal brotherhood. The wives of these operatives were expected to be beautiful, gracious, and above all, utterly blind to the machinations of their husbands. They were the manicured camouflage covering the brutal realities of statecraft. Cord Meyer rose to become a principal architect of Operation Mockingbird, a sprawling, highly classified campaign to infiltrate and control the domestic and foreign media. The agency was actively purchasing journalists, planning fabricated stories, and engineering the reality that the American public consumed at their breakfast tables. Mary watched this happen from the inside. She listened to the hushed conversations. She witnessed the arrogance of men who believed they possessed the divine right to manipulate the truth. She was learning the mechanics of the machine. The system is merciless precisely because it does not view truth as a moral absolute. It views truth as a malleable commodity to be weaponized for national security. And Mary, with her sharp analytical mind, was quietly archiving these methodologies. She was becoming a liability long before she ever posed a direct threat. The true fracture in Mary's compliance, however, was not born of political ideology. It was born of unimaginable soul-crushing trauma. In the winter of 1956, her 9-year-old son Michael was struck and killed by a car on a road near their home. The death of a child is an apocalyptic event for any mother, but in the sterile, emotionally lobotomized culture of the CIA elite, grief was treated as a tactical weakness. The men running the world could not afford the messy, unpredictable nature of profound human suffering. The agency culture demanded stoicism. Cord Meyer, deeply entrenched in the paranoia of his clandestine work, retreated further into the shadows, unable or unwilling to meet Mary in the depths of her despair. This trauma was the catalyst for her emancipation. When a human being is forced to endure the ultimate loss, the superficial rules of society lose their grip. Mary looked at the men in her social circle, men who were calmly calculating nuclear kill ratios and drafting plans to assassinate foreign leaders, and she realized they were emotionally dead. They were hollow suits operating a machine that ground human bone into geopolitical capital. The death of her son stripped away the velvet illusion of Georgetown. She began to view the American intelligence apparatus as a deeply flawed institution, managed by paranoid men whose obsession with control pushed the world toward the brink of destruction. In 1958, Mary filed for divorce. In the geopolitical panopticon of Washington, divorcing a high-ranking intelligence officer was not just a personal failure. It was a breach of protocol. It made her an outlier. It made her a loose end. Stepping out of the shadow of her marriage, Mary reinvented herself. She moved into a converted carriage house and threw herself into abstract painting. But she did not leave Washington. She remained geographically and socially adjacent to the epicenter of power, operating as a bohemian freethinker who knew exactly where the skeletons were buried. It was during this period of personal renaissance that she began to explore the outer edges of human consciousness. The Cold War logic of mutually assured destruction seemed like a collective psychosis to Mary. She sought out Timothy Leary, the Harvard psychologist who was pioneering research into psychedelics. Mary did not view LSD as a recreational escape. She viewed it as a neurological crowbar. She believed that if the men whose fingers hovered over the nuclear button could experience ego death, if they could be forced to see the interconnectedness of humanity, they could be steered away from the brink of global annihilation. By the time John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, Mary Meyer was uniquely positioned. She and JFK had known each other for years, moving in the same elite circles. But their dynamic fundamentally shifted when he became president. Kennedy was surrounded by hawkish generals and intelligence directors who constantly pressured him to escalate conflicts in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Berlin. The military-industrial complex demanded blood and budget. JFK felt isolated, increasingly distrustful of his own intelligence apparatus, particularly after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, which the CIA had explicitly designed to back him into a corner. Mary offered Kennedy something no one else in Washington could provide: a sanctuary of truth devoid of institutional agenda. Their affair, which escalated in 1962, was profoundly intellectual and deeply subversive. This was not the frivolous, star-struck tryst of a Hollywood actress. This was a convergence of two minds feeling the crushing weight of the establishment. Mary brought marijuana and, allegedly, LSD into the private quarters of the White House. But more importantly, she brought a radical pacifist perspective. She actively challenged his policies. She urged him to reject the war hawks. She pushed him toward the limited test ban treaty and encouraged his back-channel communications with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The intelligence community naturally was watching. James Jesus Angleton, the fiercely paranoid head of CIA counterintelligence, managed a domestic surveillance network that missed nothing. The agency recognized the unparalleled access Mary Meyer possessed. They saw a divorced, uncontainable woman, a woman fully educated in the dark arts of CIA propaganda and manipulation, whispering into the ear of the commander-in-chief. She was actively undermining their hegemony. She was altering the psychological state of the President of the United States, steering him toward a de-escalation of the Cold War that threatened the very existence of the intelligence military syndicate. In the eyes of the deep state, Mary Pinchot Meyer had crossed the Rubicon. She was no longer just a disgruntled ex-wife or a bohemian artist. She was an unvetted, unclassified, and highly influential rogue agent operating within the absolute inner sanctum of executive power. She possessed a deep systemic understanding of how the agency lied, and she possessed the ear of the only man on earth who had the power to dismantle them. The system operates on a simple, unforgiving algorithm. Any variable that threatens the structural integrity of the machine must be neutralized. As the autumn of 1963 approached, the tension in Washington was reaching a fever pitch. Kennedy was actively moving to bypass the CIA, establishing direct lines of communication with adversaries, and openly discussing his desire to splinter the agency into 1,000 pieces. Mary Meyer was at the height of her influence, feeling a dangerous, intoxicating sense of hope that the monolithic war machine could actually be dismantled from the inside out. They were two people walking blindly toward an abyss, entirely underestimating the violent, self-correcting mechanisms of the American deep state. The tragedy of Mary Meyer's awakening was that it armed her with everything except the means to defend herself. Trauma had given her clarity. Independence had given her a voice. Her intellect had given her access to the highest office in the land. But she fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast she was trying to tame. She believed that because she was born of the aristocracy, because she knew the men who ran the agency personally, she was immune to their brutality. She believed that ideas and empathy could defeat entrenched, institutionalized paranoia. As November 1963 loomed on the horizon, the gears of the system were already grinding into motion. The trap was not yet set for Mary on the towpath, but the political assassinations that would define the decade were about to commence. When the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, they would shatter the president's skull, but they would also shatter Mary's illusion of safety. The death of John F. Kennedy would not silence her. Instead, it would ignite a furious, relentless quest for the truth that would force her to write her own death warrant page by page in a small private diary. The awakening was complete. The countdown to the kill zone had begun. The aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 did not just leave America in mourning, it plunged Mary Pinchot Meyer into a state of profound, terrifying clarity. For the average citizen, the tragedy in Dallas was a senseless act of violence perpetrated by a lone communist sympathizer. But Mary was not an average citizen. She had spent over a decade married into the upper echelons of the Central Intelligence Agency. She understood the mechanics of covert operations, the architecture of plausible deniability, and the lethal efficiency with which the establishment removed obstacles. She knew the president's private intentions to de-escalate the Cold War, and she knew exactly how deeply the military intelligence syndicate despised him for it. While the nation wept, Mary began to investigate. Her grief did not manifest as paralysis. It weaponized her intellect. In the months following Dallas, Mary became increasingly isolated, pulling away from the polite society of Georgetown. She began to discreetly leverage her extensive network, quietly interrogating her connections within the intelligence community and the political elite. She was searching for the seams in the official narrative, and because she knew how the architects of American propaganda operated, she found them with alarming speed. She began documenting her findings, her suspicions, and her intimate knowledge of the CIA's darkest methodologies in a private diary. To understand the sheer peril of her actions, one must understand the bureaucratic psychology of the deep state during 1964. The system is not a cartoonish villain operating out of malice. It is a cold, self-preserving organism. It prioritizes structural continuity above all human life. In late September 1964, the Warren Commission released its official report, definitively concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The establishment required the American public to swallow this narrative to prevent a catastrophic loss of faith in the government. At that exact historical moment, a highly connected, fiercely independent woman who had shared the president's bed and understood the CIA's psychological warfare tactics, was actively compiling a dossier that could tear the Warren report to shreds. Mary Meyer was no longer just a grieving former lover. In the sterile, unfeeling calculus of national security, she had classified herself as an existential threat. For those who study the dark mechanics of the deep state, the decision to eliminate her is believed to be a quiet clinical consensus reached by men calculating the acceptable collateral damage of maintaining the empire. In this theory, once the authorization was quietly nodded through, the problem was handed down to the operational level. The objective was simple: terminate the target, secure or destroy the intelligence she possessed, and construct a narrative that would immediately satisfy the press and the local police. This brings us to the terrifying precision of the environment they chose for her execution. The establishment does not improvise political assassinations. They do not rely on luck. They rely on the rigorous application of tactical doctrine. A successful covert termination requires the meticulous selection of a kill zone. In military and intelligence terminology, a kill zone is a specific geographical area engineered to offer the target no avenue of escape while providing the operative with optimal cover, a clear line of sight, and an untraceable route of extraction. The operatives assigned to Mary Meyer did not simply follow her and wait for an opportunity. They mapped her life. They monitored her daily routines, her phone calls, and her habits. They quickly identified her vulnerability, almost every day seeking solace and inspiration for her painting. Mary took a midday walk along the Chesapeake and Ohio CO Canal towpath. On paper, the Georgetown towpath seemed idyllic, a picturesque, tree-lined trail steeped in the affluent safety of one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods. But to the trained eye of a covert operative, the towpath was a geographical death trap. It is a narrow strip of dirt and gravel. On one side lies the deep, murky water of the canal and the Potomac River. On the other side rises a steep, heavily wooded embankment leading up to the main road. If a target is intercepted on that path, lateral movement is impossible. You cannot run left or right. You can only go forward or backward. It is a natural corridor that strips the victim of evasion tactics. On the morning of the 12th of October, 1964, the trap was set. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. Mary spent the morning in her art studio, a converted garage behind her sister's house. Shortly after midday, she changed into a pair of old sneakers, a light blue sweater, and a pair of paint-stained corduroy trousers. She carried no purse, no wallet, and no identification. She was simply a woman stepping out for a breath of fresh air, utterly unaware that she was walking onto a meticulously designed stage. As she descended onto the towpath, the operative was already in position. The intelligence apparatus does not employ street thugs for this caliber of work. The man tracking Mary was a phantom, an individual highly trained in the arts of stalking, silent approach, and rapid takedowns. He shadowed her, maintaining a calculated distance, waited for the precise mathematical moment when the variables aligned in his favor. He waited for her to walk roughly a mile down the path, far enough away from the populated access points. He waited for the ambient noise of the nearby Key Bridge to mask the sound of movement. Most importantly, he waited for her to enter a specific critical blind spot. Along that stretch of the canal, heavy autumn foliage and the angle of the steep embankment created a visual vacuum, completely obscuring that section of the path from the motorists on Canal Road above and the rowers on the river below. When Mary stepped into that isolated pocket of shadow, the geographical funnel closed around her. The operative accelerated his pace, closing the gap from behind with predatory silence. The attack was not a robbery. A mugger shouts commands, demands compliance, and uses the threat of violence to extract property. The man who grabbed Mary Meyer from behind did not speak. He did not ask for money. He engaged in a rapid, kinetic physical subdual. Mary was a strong, athletic woman, and the forensic evidence, including broken branches and scuff marks in the dirt, indicates she fought back fiercely. She struggled against the grip of her attacker, realizing in a fraction of a second that this man was not there to rob her. He was there to erase her. But sheer willpower cannot overcome professional tactical training. The struggle was brief, lasting only long enough for the operative to unholster his weapon and force her into the optimal position for execution. She had walked into a slaughterhouse disguised as a nature trail. The illusion of her aristocratic safety had been violently shattered, replaced by the cold, uncompromising brutality of the system she had dared to challenge. The tragedy of the CO Canal towpath is that Mary Meyer died entirely alone, surrounded by the autumn beauty of the city that had defined her life. She was a woman who had tried to inject humanity into a machine that operated entirely without it. When she fought her attacker in the dirt, she was fighting the physical manifestation of the Cold War itself, silent, ruthless, and absolute. The deep state had successfully maneuvered her into the kill zone. The trap had sprung flawlessly. But the true signature of the intelligence apparatus was not just in the choice of location, it was in the chilling clinical precision of the bullets that were about to be fired. The narrative of a panicked street robbery was about to be completely dismantled by the uncompromising reality of forensic science. The silence that followed the struggle on the towpath was absolute. For the intelligence apparatus, the physical act of murder is merely the first phase of an operation. The second, and arguably more critical phase, is the immediate management of the aftermath. When a wealthy, prominent white woman is murdered in broad daylight in an affluent enclave of Washington, D.C., public panic is instantaneous. The establishment understood that the local police force, under immense pressure from the press and terrified residents, would aggressively hunt for an explanation. The system needed to provide them with one that was entirely apolitical. They needed a narrative that severed Mary Pinchot Meyer from the White House, from the CIA, and from the diary she kept. The narrative they deployed was the oldest, most convenient trope in the urban playbook, a robbery gone wrong. It is a story the public instinctively understands and fears. It is random, it is tragic, and crucially, it requires no systemic investigation into the victim's political affiliations. When the Metropolitan Police Department arrived at the canal, this was the premise they operated under. But the intelligence community, in its arrogance, had underestimated the rigid, uncompromising nature of forensic science. You can coerce witnesses and you can redact documents, but you cannot alter the physical trajectory of a bullet through human flesh. When Deputy Coroner Dr. Richard Whelton arrived to examine the body, he did not look at Mary Meyer, the socialite. He looked at the canvas of a crime scene. And what that canvas revealed immediately dismantled the botched robbery theory. A street mugging is a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled event. A mugger is driven by panic, poverty, and desperation. If they discharge a firearm, it is usually from a distance, fired erratically, targeting the center mass of the body simply because it is the largest target. They fire, they grab whatever valuables they can strip from the victim, and they run. Mary's body told a profoundly different story. Dr. Whelton noted the presence of a dark, distinct halo of stippling around the entry wounds. Stippling is the forensic term for the abrasive burn marks caused by unburned gunpowder and superheated gases exploding from the muzzle of a gun. For stippling to embed itself into human skin, the weapon must be fired from a distance of mere inches. This was not a shot fired in a panic from a few yards away. This was a point-blank discharge. It requires an intimacy with the victim that a panicked street thief actively avoids. It requires the shooter to step directly into the victim's personal space, look them in the eye, and pull the trigger. Let us break down the clinical brutality of the ballistics. The first shot was not aimed at her torso. The weapon was raised and fired directly into the left side of Mary's head, near the cheekbone and temple. This is a highly specific tactical target. A shot to this region of the cranium is designed to instantly shut down the central nervous system. It neutralizes the target immediately, preventing any sustained screaming, fighting, or fleeing. It is the hallmark of a shooter who understands human anatomy and requires absolute silence. As Mary collapsed to the dirt, Incapacitated but potentially still alive, the killer's training dictated the next move. An amateur would have panicked at the sight of blood and fled. This operative did not run. He stepped over the fallen woman. He assessed the situation. He recognized that a head wound, while devastating, is not always immediately fatal depending on the caliber of the weapon and the exact trajectory through the brain. He needed absolute certainty. He aimed his weapon downwards and fired a second shot. This bullet entered through Mary's right shoulder blade. The angle was deliberate. It traveled down through her chest cavity, violently severing her aorta. The severing of the aorta is a definitive killing stroke. The aorta is the main artery carrying oxygenated blood from the heart to the rest of the body. When it is severed, the victim bleeds out internally within seconds. The blood pressure drops to 0 instantaneously. There is no chance of resuscitation, no chance of surgical intervention, and absolutely no chance of the victim surviving to provide a description of her attacker. This sequence of events, a close-range shot to the head to incapacitate, followed by a deliberate shot through the chest, bears the hallmarks of a clinical execution-style killing. It strongly mirrors the emotionless, procedural tactics often associated with specialized military and covert training. The psychology required to execute this maneuver is chilling. The shooter must possess a resting heart rate in the middle of a homicide. They must be able to compartmentalize the horrific violence they are inflicting, treating the human being in front of them not as a person, but as an objective to be cleared. Furthermore, the physical state of the victim rendered the robbery motive mathematically absurd. Mary was not dressed for a Georgetown luncheon. She was wearing a cheap light blue sweater, a pair of cut-off corduroy trousers covered in paint from her studio, and old canvas plimsolls. She carried no purse. She had no wallet. She did not even have identification on her person. There was absolutely nothing of financial value to steal. The killer took nothing because theft was never the objective. The objective was the permanent cessation of her intellectual threat. Why choose this method? Why not a staged suicide or a tragic car accident like the one that had claimed her son years earlier? The deep state is nothing if not communicative. To the general public reading the morning paper, the death of Mary Meyer was a tragic tale of urban crime. But to the elite circle of Washington insiders, the intelligence directors, the political fixers, and the few who knew the true depth of Mary's relationship with John F. Kennedy, the method of her death was a broadcasted message. A point-blank execution on a public path in broad daylight is a demonstration of absolute impunity. It is the intelligence apparatus flexing its operational muscle. The message to the Georgetown set was unequivocal. We do not need the cover of darkness. We do not need to make it look like an accident. We can walk up to one of your own in the middle of the day, put 2 bullets in her chest and head, and we will simply categorize it as street crime. And there is nothing you can do about it. It is a psychological warfare tactic designed to induce terror and compliance within the ranks of the elite. If a woman of Mary Pinchot Meyer's aristocratic pedigree and presidential intimacy could be butchered so casually, then no one was safe. It reinforced the unwritten law of the Capitol. You may enjoy the privileges of power, but you never, under any circumstances, threaten the machine that provides them. Dr. Welton's forensic findings were documented, the stippling was noted, and the trajectory of the bullets was recorded. The science proved without a shadow of a doubt that a highly trained assassin had operated on the towpath that afternoon. But in the ecosystem of American justice, forensic truth is entirely useless if the police force is directed to look the other way. The state possessed the body, and they knew how she died. Now they desperately needed someone to blame. They needed a face to put on the evening news to close the psychological loop for the public. The operative had vanished into the autumn woods, leaving behind a geographic vacuum. And into that vacuum, the police were about to drag a man whose only crime was the color of his skin and his proximity to power. The autopsy of Mary Pinchot Meyer is a stark reminder that the body cannot be coerced into lying. The state can redact files, they can classify documents, and they can silence witnesses, but the flesh records the truth of its own destruction. To those questioning the official narrative, the 2 bullets fired into Mary were not random pieces of lead. They represented the ultimate lethal consequence of challenging a powerful and secretive institution. They represent the precise moment when the American intelligence apparatus decided that the life of a prominent citizen was worth less than the secret she carried in her mind. But a successful cover-up requires 2 components. The first is the elimination of the threat. The second is the installation of a scapegoat. The public demands a villain, and the system is always happy to manufacture one. As Mary's body lay on the cold steel of the coroner's table, her physical suffering finally at an end, the psychological torment of another innocent human being was just beginning. The true cruelty of the system is that it does not just destroy its targets, it casually destroys anyone who happens to be standing in the way of its alibi. The echo of the 2 gunshots had barely faded over the Potomac River before the secondary mechanism of the assassination protocol was triggered. When an intelligence apparatus executes a high-profile target in a public space, the operatives know they are working against a violently ticking clock. The murder creates an immediate explosive vacuum of information. The press will demand answers. The affluent, powerful residents of Georgetown will demand safety. If the police are allowed to conduct a genuine, unrestricted homicide investigation, there is always a statistical probability that a diligent detective might stumble upon the wrong footprint, the wrong witness, or the wrong motive. Therefore, the system cannot simply assassinate the target and vanish. They must actively manage the resulting panic. They must supply a distraction. They must manufacture a villain. In the highly segregated, racially volatile atmosphere of Washington, D.C. in 1964, the easiest villain to manufacture was a black man. Enter Ray Crump Jr. Crump was a 25-year-old day laborer, a man completely invisible to the elite political circles in which Mary Pinchot Meyer operated. On the 12th of October, he was not executing a geopolitical conspiracy. He was simply playing hooky from work. He had bought some beer, walked down to the river to drink quietly, and accidentally slipped off a rock into the Potomac, soaking his clothes. As he wandered the area trying to dry off, the police dragnet swept the towpath. Approximately 40 minutes after the execution of Mary Meyer, an officer spotted Crump. He was black, he was wet, and he was in the vicinity. For the authorities, this was not just probable cause, it was a miraculous convenience. Within hours, Ray Crump Jr. was in handcuffs, formally charged with the first-degree murder of one of Washington's most prominent socialites. To the press and the panicked public, the police presented a tightly wrapped package. The wealthy white woman, the tragic robbery gone wrong, and the desperate black laborer caught fleeing the scene. It was a narrative so deeply ingrained in the prejudices of the era that it was swallowed without chewing. But if you strip away the racial bias and apply the cold, uncompromising logic of forensic science, the case against Ray Crump Jr. was not just weak, it was physically and mathematically absurd. Let us begin with the physical mismatch. Mary Meyer was 5 feet 6 inches tall, athletic, and fiercely strong. The scuff marks and broken branches at the crime scene proved she had engaged in a violent, desperate struggle with her attacker before the shots were fired. Ray Crump Jr. was a slight, diminutive man. He stood only 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed a mere 130 pounds. The idea that this small, unarmed laborer could have effortlessly overpowered a struggling athletic woman, executed her with the clinical precision of a special forces operative, and vanished into the woods without a scratch on him is an insult to basic physics. Then there is the glaring absence of forensic tissue. When a human being is shot twice at point-blank range, once in the head and once through the aorta, the resulting blowback is catastrophic. The shooter would be standing directly in the trajectory of high-velocity blood spatter and tissue mist. When the police arrested Ray Crump Jr. just 40 minutes later, his clothes were thoroughly examined. They found river water and dirt. They found absolutely no blood. Furthermore, they conducted swab tests for gunshot residue. Firing a weapon leaves microscopic traces of barium and antimony on the hands and clothing of the shooter. Crump was completely clean. Finally, there was the weapon itself. The murder weapon was a .38 caliber Smith Wesson revolver. The police launched a massive, exhaustive search. They deployed scuba divers to drag the murky bottom of the canal. They sent lines of officers, shoulder to shoulder, to comb through every inch of the autumn foliage on the embankment. They emptied the storm drains. The gun had vanished. A panicked street mugger does not possess the logistical foresight to perfectly vaporize a murder weapon within a 40-minute window while wandering around in wet clothes. Under the unforgiving scrutiny of the facts, Ray Crump Jr. was clearly innocent, but in the eyes of the deep state, his innocence was entirely irrelevant. Crump was not meant to be a mastermind. He was meant to be the patsy. The concept of the patsy is a foundational pillar of covert operations. A patsy is a human shield erected hastily to absorb the initial blinding glare of public and media scrutiny. The patsy does not need to hold up to the rigors of historical analysis or decades of forensic debate. The patsy only needs to hold up for the first 48 hours. By feeding Ray Crump Jr. to the Metropolitan Police and the ravenous press corps, the true architects of the assassination achieved their primary objective: time. While the detectives were busy interrogating a terrified day laborer, the professional operative who pulled the trigger was calmly walking away, boarding a flight, or disappearing back behind the classified walls of the intelligence apparatus. The system needed a garbage bin to dump the blame into, and Crump was simply the closest target. However, the establishment made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed that a poor black laborer in 1964 would be chewed up by the judicial machinery without a fight. They did not anticipate the arrival of Dovey Johnson Roundtree. Roundtree was a formidable, brilliant African-American female defense attorney. She took Crump's case when no one else would touch it, and she stepped into the courtroom ready to dismantle the state's manufactured illusion. Roundtree did not just defend Crump, she aggressively prosecuted the police's timeline. She methodically exposed the lack of blood, the missing weapon, and the sheer physical impossibility of the struggle. But her masterstroke was the cross-examination of the prosecution's star witness, a tow truck mechanic named Henry Wiggins. Wiggins had been standing on Canal Road above the towpath. He heard the shots, looked down, and saw a man standing over Mary Meyer's body. Wiggins testified under oath that the killer was wearing a light-colored jacket and dark trousers. Roundtree presented the clothing Ray Crump Jr. was wearing at the exact moment of his arrest: a bright, zipped-up golf jacket and a plaid cap. It was a visual impossibility. The man standing over the corpse was a phantom, a professional who had blended back into the environment. Ray Crump Jr. was just a man who had fallen into a river. Faced with the overwhelming lack of physical evidence and Roundtree's devastating dissection of the timeline, the jury deliberated. Despite the immense racial and political pressures of the era, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Ray Crump Jr. was acquitted. The acquittal of Ray Crump Jr. was a triumph of the legal defense, but it was a hollow victory for justice. Crump walked out of the courtroom a free man, but his life had been irrevocably shattered. He had been thrown into the meat grinder of the American intelligence state, used as a disposable prop in a geopolitical assassination, and spat back out. He would suffer from severe psychological trauma for the rest of his life, a casualty of a war he did not even know was being fought. But the true horror of the Patsy Protocol is how effectively it closes the systemic loop. When Crump was acquitted, the police did not launch a new manhunt. They did not widen the perimeter. They did not look toward the CIA or the Georgetown elite. The investigation simply died of institutional apathy. The deep state had successfully insulated the kill zone. While the police chased a phantom suspect along the riverbank, the true objective of the assassination was unfolding miles away. Mary's body had been silenced, but her diary had not. The physical execution was complete. Now, the intelligence apparatus deployed its cleanup crew to secure the secrets she left behind. To understand the sheer arrogance of this phase of the operation, you must look at the man tasked with the infiltration. The establishment did not send a low-level burglar or a local police detective to retrieve the diary. They sent James Jesus Angleton. In the 1960s, Angleton was the director of counterintelligence for the CIA. He was known throughout Washington as the Spider, a chain-smoking, deeply paranoid mastermind who managed the agency's most sensitive illegal domestic surveillance programs. He was a man who possessed the power to topple foreign governments and ruin domestic political careers with a single phone call. Yet, On the afternoon of October 12, 1964, the director of counterintelligence was standing outside Mary Meyer's private art studio, armed with a set of professional lockpicks. The timeline of Angleton's arrival is the most damning piece of circumstantial evidence in the entire case. Mary's body had only just been identified. The police had not yet formally notified her family. The press had not yet broadcast her name. Yet, Angleton was already at her property, actively bypassing the locks. Conspiracy researchers point out a chilling possibility. If the intelligence apparatus were the authors of the event, they would not need to wait for a police report. They would know she was dead the moment the second bullet was fired. When Angleton finally breached the studio, he began a frantic, systematic search. He was hunting for the ledger of the American Empire, the diary where Mary had meticulously documented her conversations with John F. Kennedy, her knowledge of CIA propaganda networks, and her suspicions regarding the assassination in Dallas. But Angleton was interrupted. Mary's sister, Toni, and her brother-in-law, Ben Bradley, arrived at the property. Bradley was not just a grieving family member. He was a titan of American journalism, a man who would soon become the legendary executive editor of the Washington Post. When Bradley walked into his murdered sister-in-law's home, he did not find police investigators securing a crime scene. He found the CIA's chief spy tearing the place apart. In a functioning democracy, a journalist discovering a federal intelligence director illegally breaking into a murder victim's home would be the scandal of the century. It would trigger congressional hearings. But Washington in the 1960s was not a functioning democracy. It was an aristocratic syndicate. Bradley and Angleton were friends. They belonged to the same elite Georgetown clubs. They operated under the same unspoken social contract. When Angleton explained that he was there to secure Mary's diary to protect the legacy of the late President Kennedy, Bradley did not call the police. He did not write a front-page expose. He actually helped Angleton search the property. They eventually found the diary. In a moment that defies all legal and moral logic, the central piece of evidence in an active homicide investigation was willingly handed over to the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the ultimate, terrifying manifestation of evidence tampering. When the intelligence apparatus steps forward to act as the cleanup crew for a murder, the law is officially nullified. The local police force, fully aware that federal agents had compromised the victim's residence and confiscated her private writings, simply closed their eyes. They asked no questions. They filed no warrants for the diary. The justice system bowed its head and surrendered its authority to the national security state. Angleton took the diary back to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. He later claimed that he personally tossed it into an industrial incinerator. Fire is the ultimate editor of history. It does not just destroy paper, it purifies the state's narrative. By burning Mary Meyer's diary, Angleton incinerated the last unfiltered record of John F. Kennedy's internal war with his own intelligence agencies. He erased Mary's voice, her intellect, and her trauma. He reduced the profound, dangerous truth of her life to a pile of classified ash. However, whisper networks within the intelligence community suggest Angleton did not burn it immediately. Rumors persist that the spider kept the diary locked in his private safe for years, using the explosive secrets within its pages to blackmail his rivals and consolidate his grip on the agency. In the end, the exact fate of the physical book is irrelevant. The objective was achieved. The truth was removed from the public domain, permanently sealed within the impenetrable vault of the deep state. With Ray Crump Jr. acquitted and the diary destroyed, the murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer officially went cold. The Metropolitan Police Department never assigned another detective to the case. They never followed up on the eyewitness descriptions of the professional operative seen standing over her body. They never investigated the CIA's illegal entry into her home. The system simply let the clock run out, burying her memory under decades of bureaucratic silence. The tragedy of Mary Meyer is not just that she was murdered. It is that her death was so flawlessly digested by the machine she tried to dismantle. She was a woman who experienced the ultimate trauma, the loss of her child, and the assassination of the man she loved, and channeled that pain into a fearless pursuit of the truth. She believed that humanity could overcome institutional paranoia. She believed that the men who ran the world could be reasoned with, enlightened, or exposed. She was wrong. The system does not possess a conscience. It does not feel empathy, and it does not tolerate enlightenment. It is a cold, self-preserving algorithm designed to crush any variable that threatens its absolute control. Mary Meyer was a beautifully complex variable, and the system calculated her elimination with the emotionless precision of a sniper's crosshairs. Her death leaves behind a warning written in blood for the elite. Never threaten the deep state. They will dispatch an assassin to put a bullet through your heart in broad daylight, grab a random vagrant off the street to take the fall, and send the director of intelligence to your front door to burn every shred of truth you left behind. You have been watching American Case Files.